Council. I hope most of you were able to participate in the National Town Hall with John Huntsman that just wrapped up. That event was produced and sponsored by the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Following the remarks of Ambassador Huntsman, we're pleased today to have a panel of China experts who are Seattle-based, who are going to help us sort through some of the key points of the conflict in the U.S.-China relationship. In the next hour, our panelists will address some of those thorny issues, adding to the insights of our previous commentator. The event today is brought to you by the Washington State China Relations Council and the China Study Program and the East Asia Center at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. We'd also like to thank the World Affairs Council based in Seattle for their promotional support. Before we start, let me briefly introduce you to the organization that I run, the Washington State China Relations Council. The council was founded in 1979 and is the oldest state-level organization of its kind. Our mission is to improve the bilateral relationship between Washington State and China, especially in the areas of business, government, culture, and education. Since the onset of the pandemic, we've produced many webinars on China-related topics. We'd encourage you to take a look at our website to see our upcoming events, as well as to view many of our past programs, which are available on our YouTube channel. I'd also like to note that our next event is going to be on December 6th, and that's a book talk with Professor Chris Marquez, who's the author of a book titled Mao and the Markets. Now let me introduce today's moderator and panelists. Our moderator, no stranger to our webinars, is Dr. Spencer Cohen, who's the principal and founder of High Peak Strategy, an international trade and economics research consulting firm based here in Seattle. He consults and writes extensively on international trade, China's economy, industry cultures, and regional economic issues. Spencer is a 2021 and 2020 through 2023 Public Intellectual Program Fellow with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. He also is an affiliate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Washington. He has a PhD from the University of Washington in Geography and an MA in China Studies from UW, and his BA was from the University of Connecticut in Mathematics and History. For our panelists today, we have two panelists today. One is Dr. Susan Whiting, a professor of political science at the University of Washington, where she holds adjunct appointments in the Jackson School of International Studies and in the School of Law. She specializes in Chinese and comparative politics with an emphasis on the political economy of development. Dr. Whiting has a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan and a BA in East Asia Studies from Yale. She was in the first cohort back in 2005 of the Public Intellectuals Program with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Our second panelist today is Dr. David Bachman, who's the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies at the Jackson School at the University of Washington. He's also the Associate Director at the Jackson School. Dr. Bachman has been a faculty member at UW since 1991, and previous to that, he taught at Stanford and Princeton universities. At UW, he teaches courses on Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, the rise of Asia, and the makings of the 21st century. Dr. Bachman received his PhD from Stanford. He's a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and he has roles in many other associations. I'd just like to mention that he did serve as the president of the Washington State China Relations Council back in 2005. So before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself on mute throughout the session. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat box. We'll try our best to get to your questions. We apologize in advance if we can't get to them all. We're scheduled today for 60 minutes. If there are a lot of questions, we'll run over a few minutes, but maximum 70 minutes. And with that, let me turn it over to Spencer to get started.
Thanks, Nor, and thank you, Nor and Mon, for organizing this event. And thank you to Susan and David for being available to share insights today. It's really great to chat with both of you. My first question is really just to kick things off. We've heard a lot of topics covered today in today's conversation with Ambassador Huntsman. So we heard about the CHIPS Act and semiconductors, trade issues. He brought up the Comprehensive Progressive Partnership, Trans-Pacific Partnership. He really emphasized people-to-people diplomacy. And also he reflected quite a bit on the evolution of China's political economy beginning in 2013. I would love to just first, maybe each of you could share your immediate reactions to what the ambassador shared as part of the webcast. Susan, do you want to start?
Sure, and I'd also like to thank you and the Washington State China Relations Council and the National Committee on U.S. China Relations for making all this possible. Yeah, I think first the opening was important, and that is the symbolic and substantive creation of political space, and coming out of the meeting with Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, so that we see that there is some political space, a signaling of political space for moving forward in U.S.-China relations. And I think the second thing I would say is that domestic politics on both sides shaped the ability to use this space to advance our respective national interests. So we're looking towards appointments and transition in both cases going forward. So Ambassador Huntsman talked about, who's going to chair the Ways and Means Committee and how that will inform trade policy. We're looking towards the final determinations of who is going to have the economic portfolio on the Chinese side. So I think that there's political space, but domestic politics will shape what we can do with it. And then I was struck by both cooperation and tensions in trade and investment. So thinking about cooperation where the links in supply chains have really integrated two economies and how that has been disrupted by COVID-19 and as Ambassador Huntsman suggested, destabilized an important stabilizing factor in the relationship. And we also see continuing tensions around market access, intellectual property theft, those sorts of things. So there's both this space for cooperation that's been disrupted and ongoing tensions. Finally, I would say, thinking about domestic politics, it's striking that the CHIPS Act, right, has some bilateral support, right, and so we see the emphasis not just on trade but also competition, as Ambassador Huntsman highlighted. So thinking about U.S. industrial policy in terms of U.S. competitiveness, getting our own house in order, onshoring, and which in some ways the kind of reorientation of political and academic communities around industrial policy is striking. And thinking about, I would just allude to a recent Peterson Institute study that highlighted that R&D spending is probably the biggest bang for your buck on industrial policy. And we see bilateral support for that going forward in a kind of competitive footing with China, as there are trade restrictions on semiconductor exports. So those are the things I would take away.
Cool, thank you. David, what are your thoughts?
Well, Susan said many of them, but I would say that the presentation that Ambassador Huntsman made was heavy on trade, economics, looking at the U.S. domestic political scene and people-to-people engagement. And while that's fine, it sort of elides some of the many issues that are buried there. So it's difficult for us to do people-to-people relations when we've got to deal with zero COVID policies and quarantines and so on. It's difficult to think about expanding trade when you don't get at, except in passing, issues of state subsidies for Chinese state-owned enterprises and intellectual property theft and so on. It's also difficult when you don't acknowledge that that the sort of security focus of the U.S. government seems to be predominating over the economic focus of the U.S. government, at least when it comes to China policy. And because of that, we have the National Security Strategy of the United States that came out in October, where President Biden is portraying this competition between democracy and autocracy, where Monday, where President Biden and Xi Jinping agreed that this was going to be a friendly competition. And then if you read the New York Times today about the competition for investment in Southeast Asia, that's pretty zero-sum. So we don't have really a good off-ramp for this competition. We don't have any rules for this competition. And then we feed it into the U.S. domestic political system, where we've got the sharp partisanship, and where I think it would be extraordinarily difficult, at least in my reading of domestic politics, for one side, presumably the Democrats and President Biden, to make concessions, such as was suggested, removing the tariffs, without being scored or gored for making concessions to the evil Chinese Communist Party. So I think it's a very difficult road to walk to advance U.S.-China relations. And while I agree, people-to-people are very important, people-to-people relations are very important, trade is very important, we have to also acknowledge that they're functioning in this broader environment that creates very strong headwinds against advancing those things.
And thank you both. And as a follow-up to that, it seems like, especially David, to your last points about the environment that we're operating in with respect to U.S.-China relations. I mean, I was struck, it seems like the last few years, there's been a lot of literature coming out of DC that really makes this assumption about China as a threat, or the China challenge. And despite a lot of scholars believing that there are benefits, as the ambassador mentioned with TPP or CPTPP, for instance, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of maneuverability, even if the Biden administration, for political reasons, wanted to perhaps disengage on some of these issues, or at least scale back some. Would you agree with that? Is that consistent with what you've observed?
Well, my sense is that the national security establishment of the United States began to turn against China in a big way after the island building in the South China Sea in 2014. And that accelerated, certainly with the Trump administration, that I read the Biden national security strategy as an outgrowth from the strategy that Matthew Pottinger put together back in December 2017 for the Trump administration, which the Trump administration tried to follow. It wasn't clear that President Trump tried to follow the Trump administration's policy much of the time. So I see a great deal of continuity actually in our policy, rather than seeing, as Ambassador Huntsman implied, that it's just the last 2 years. Obviously, since the tariff war started in 2018, the relationship has deteriorated quite dramatically. COVID made it obviously a much more polarized issue as well. And so Biden's inherited that. And he's tried to rationalize it in some ways, as was mentioned with invest, align, compete. But what comes across is really compete, and a compete where, again, there are no rules, there's no off-ramp, there's no conditionality to it. And so it's cast in a struggle between democracy and autocracy. And how else could Americans perceive that as anything less than a zero-sum type of conflict? And that's problematic. It seems to me deeply problematic.
Staying on the topic of U.S.-China relations, so this week, President Biden and General Secretary Xi met on the sidelines of the G20 in Bali. What is your? I'd like to hear your thoughts, both of you, on what was your read of the meeting? Were there any major takeaways from your perspective? Was anything significant in terms of easing tensions? There was a bit of a reiteration, the 5 no's, for instance. Biden came away with the belief, or the stated belief, that there's no imminent invasion, for instance. Susan, maybe start with you. What were some of your immediate? How did you read that meeting, and did you notice? Were there any takeaways of note from that meeting?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I again would come back to this idea of political space and at least the potential, and David's comments highlight the, as he put it, headwinds, but potential for finding some areas of cooperation. I think that, yeah, the statement he made in his press conference afterwards that an invasion of Taiwan was not imminent can maybe take it, reset some of the positions in Washington we see. And I think similarly, Ambassador Huntsman's comments were also trying to, and the questions that were foregrounded in the National Committee discussion were really trying to highlight areas of cooperation. Climate didn't come up, but climate comes to mind, healthcare, these areas that where there's potential, yet these significant headwinds. So I don't know that it's really changed anything significantly, except in tone.
David, what are your thoughts?
I certainly agree with Susan that it may have changed the tone for a while. It has to be followed up with some substance. I think that I would certainly agree with Ambassador Huntsman that it was very good that they met in person, had these extensive discussions for 3 hours, and both sides made clear what really mattered to them. So that was Taiwan for Xi Jinping, and the fear that the US's one China principle was one China policy was being eroded, while China was adamant about its one China principle. And at the same time, as I read President Biden's statements coming out, it did seem he recognized that the way the national security strategy cast the relationship as this deep competition between the two, that he had perhaps oversold it, that the competition could have rules, it could be managed. It didn't mean as zero-sum as a competition between democracy and autocracy would seem to imply. And I think all of this was very helpful to, as some people called it, to reestablish a floor in the relationship. But a floor is the bottom, right? So it means we hope we don't go below that floor. But now the follow-up is to go up some steps or go up the wall, or whatever the metaphor we want to use might be, to come out of this bottom up to a higher level of finding more cooperative arrangements, and agreeing with Ambassador Huntsman that let's, on most of the issues where we disagree, put them in a basket and say, we disagree here, we're not going to be able to resolve these, and work incrementally, instrumentally, whatever we want to say about these areas of common concern, health, climate being two of the most important.
In the other side, or another dimension of diplomacy, is the subnational or even informal sort of communications, familial exchange, families, cultural, tourism, education. And I was struck by in 2019, I think it was 2018, I'm sorry, there were 11,000 American foreign students living in China, learning Chinese, learning about Chinese culture. Many of them had ambitions to either go into academia, or I'm sure, or go into business, but to be involved in that kind of dual track sort of exchange or diplomacy. And that number today is 300. And I don't anticipate that's going to change a lot. I mean, maybe with different, projections, but it seems like, at least in the near term, how concerned are you about that loss of exchange? I mean, fortunately, we're having the diplomatic exchange, but that loss of that sort of non-state, informal sort of exchange and communication and learning. I mean, all of us have, certainly the three of us, certainly, I'm sure many other people on this call have spent a lot of time in China, have studied in China. How concerned are you about the loss of that exchange of peoples and students? Susan, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, I think this is a huge cost and it affects a whole range of issues in the bilateral relationship. It's in terms of understanding of China, of shared issues, and the training the people who are going to take jobs in the corporate sector, also in the U.S. government, will not have that exposure. And I think in some ways we saw some of that even before the COVID lockdowns because of like hiring practices in the U.S. government where spending time in China is actually a security concern. So I think in DC, there's perhaps not a lot of value put on building these connections under understanding life on the ground in China. And in fact, it's a security risk. So I think there's a huge cost there. And it's hard to see how it will revive, particularly even as we see just minor steps in easing zero COVID, because it shows the vulnerability of people, including Chinese citizens there. I think there are also other risks in terms of not hearing the range of Chinese voices, policy concerns, that's not very visible at the highest levels of the political system. And yet there are a range of policy positions out there, and it's very difficult to hear them without face-to-face conversation. So we don't understand the range of concerns in the policy agenda.
David, what are your thoughts?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with what Susan said, that it hurts us in many ways, in the same way that restrictions on Chinese students coming to the U.S. hurts us being both China and the U.S. And it makes it harder to train younger generations of people who are well versed in cross-cultural communications. It just, you know, it erodes the glue that does provide a fair amount, that has kept the relationship going. You know, in my class, I talk about people-to-people relationships as something that helps to explain why it was harder for the United States not to demonize China in the way that that we did the Soviet Union, that we had these networks and human connections that really sort of made it impossible to pass down this view about, you know, as we used to have in the Cold War, atheistic communism in Russia or in the Soviet Union, and how purely evil they were. And we've experienced some truly awful things in the PRC over the last 30 some years. But we also realized that China is more than just the government, that there are people doing their best to get ahead and along in that system. Many of them believe that healthy relations with the US are part of that. And if we're not there, I'm mixing up my pronouns here, but if Americans aren't there in significant numbers, then we're allowing, again, the energy, the synergies that were formed to gradually dissipate. And that's going to have long-term negative consequences on a relationship that, at least until Bali, was already heading in negative directions. Whether it's stabilized remains to be seen.
So I'd like to switch topics to another recent event that's caught a lot of attention, which of course is the 20th Party Congress. And I'd like to start at the 10,000 foot level, because there's a lot to unpack. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions too in the Q&A. But at a 10,000 foot level, what are some of for each of you, what are some of the most notable changes or developments in the party leadership and implications this might have for both domestic and foreign policy in the near future? And as part of that, you know, setting aside the awkward Hu Jintao moment at the end, were there any surprises that struck you? Susan, do you want to go first?
Well, it's hard to say that there are surprises because we had some kind of forecasting of you know, the third term and that sort of thing going forward. But that this isn't saying anything new, but this is widely viewed as a kind of norm destroying, norm busting outcome from the 20th Party Congress. And if I put on my political science hat, right, where theories of authoritarian resilience find a positive correlation between norms and respect for norms, written or unwritten, and regime durability, it raises questions about the political structures in China. The kind of clean sweep for Xi allies, 3 standing committee members of the Politburo who have worked with him closely in the capacity of secretary. Clearly, loyalty to Xi Jinping is the most important criterion. And we see, certainly Hu Jintao's factional allies really removed. That also suggests that there is potentially less space for policy debate. We really don't hear those voices. That said, I think it again shows how we couldn't predict exactly who was going to be on the standing committee of the Politburo. That shows how little knowledgeable observers, whether outside of China or inside of China, could predict who was going to be at the top of this system. And now it's not clear where we hear kind of policy debates. We aren't going to see that certainly publicly.
David?
I certainly Susan's captured what I think were the highlights there. I mean, the degree to which the party leadership is so dominated by Xi may not be a surprise, but it certainly was stark. And I'm not sure whether I really thought some of a couple of people would have made it again to the Politburo and would have hung on. I don't know how deeply influential they would have been. One of the things that struck me is the very large numbers of the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee are first party secretaries of provinces or provincial level units, that you don't see a lot of people with backgrounds in the state council, that you wonder about overall economic management and how people are going to actually administer as opposed to carry out the general policies. Obviously, party secretaries rise through the ranks and they administer things, but where do they have this national level view? Do they have this ability to say, as Li Keqiang would at various points to Xi Jinping, say, your policies sort of attacking private markets and private enterprise are hurting economic growth. And on occasion, it would cause Xi to back down. I think the projection now is that Li Qiang will be the next premier in charge of the state council. Will he do that? Will he be willing to do that? And at least I don't know enough about Li Qiang to know about it. I mean, again, you see the media speculating about, well, he was big for pushing for high tech in Shanghai and opening up the special development zone and so on. So maybe he will, and maybe he will, but maybe he also would be quickly sort of brought into line by Xi Jinping if Xi didn't like what he was saying too. So again, obviously, even if we had 100,000 Americans in China, they aren't going to know about the relationship between Li Qiang and Xi Jinping. That's just not the kind of access we have to the system. But that the whole question of how this system will work with these new people in new roles is, of course, the real questions behind who holds power. And we don't know, obviously, how it's going to work. We have a pretty clear idea from Xi Jinping about what he wants to do and what directions he wants to take China in. But that may mean the immovable object of Chinese society and economy doesn't necessarily respond to the force of the Chinese Communist Party. And so that's where we're going to have the real questions to watch. And as Ambassador Huntsman suggested, we'll obviously be watching the two meetings in presumably March next year, where the State Council gets staffed out and other kinds of things to see how this works. And of course, through whatever economic and other policy actions they take.
Did you see anything, David, on the foreign policy side? I know, for instance, like she really put a really big emphasis on security in his working report and very little on economy. So did you pick up anything with respect to any changes around or signaling around Taiwan, for instance, or foreign policy from the 20th?
No, and he said many of the same things he's been saying for a while, and he didn't mention any foreign country by name in the speech. There is this one passage that Susan's heard me and others have heard me talk about, that where she talks about China's confronting a situation that's I'm forgetting the exact words, unprecedented for a century. And this is a century where we go back a century, China was invaded, World War II, fall of communism, financial crisis. To say the last few years, presumably referring to the war in Ukraine and the U.S. sanctions against China, to say that this is an unprecedented situation, a much more challenging situation than China has ever faced before, puts the context into why he's emphasizing security as much as he did in the speech. He did talk about what I see as one of the signature elements of his foreign policy, which I think too few Western analysts pick up on, and that is he continues to play to the global South in terms of building international institutions that are more accommodative to them, that as Ambassador Huntsman said, that Russia and China both resent deeply the kinds of unique power the United States has in the international system, stemming from vetoes in places like the IMF, World Bank, the UN Security Council, the use of the dollar, and so on. And they, and not just Russia and China, but many in the global South also resent the power that goes along with those institutions. And she has any number of new initiatives, whether it's it's his global security initiative or his the global development initiative that he announced last year. All of these things are, they're poo-pooed in the West, but they are finding audiences in the global South and putting together a coalition. And he reasserted that without, again, being heavy-handed on it. It's interesting that in the readout of his coming out of the meeting with Biden, he said, we're not trying to create a new international order. In fact, I think he is trying to create a new international order. So whether that is going to be a theme to watch out for is obviously another one of those things we have to watch out.
So, Susan, I'm wondering from your perspective on the domestic, I love to hear from both of you actually, but on the domestic economic policy perspective, where do you see, were there any, China as has a lot of real challenges economically right now. We've seen productivity has been on a pretty consistent downward trend since probably 2009. We've seen debt to GDP, non-financial debt to GDP ratio been growing over time. So every new unit of investment, bank credit investment is yielding less and less output in the economy. There are demographic challenges. We could go down the whole list, I'm sure, right, of all the different issues. GDP itself has been declining. What do you think are the big challenges, and did you pick up on any messaging in the Party Congress or any outside of the Party Congress as well around what the government plans to do, or any new sort of turns or shifts in policy to address some of these challenges, including real estate?
Yeah, I think I would answer that question by stepping back and taking a longer term perspective, and comparing the kind of Xi's first term with what we're seeing so far. And typically the third plenum of any central committee is the policy kind of agenda setting meeting. We haven't seen that yet. But if I look back to Xi's first term, and the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee, I think many participants on this call will remember kind of a ambitious agenda of market-oriented reforms, unifying markets for rural and urban land, reducing obstacles to the movement of labor from rural to urban, implementing a property tax. All of these things, and it's widely seen to have made little progress in 10 years. And Xi Jinping was already perceived to be a very powerful leader at that time. But apparently either he doesn't wish to pursue that agenda, not his agenda, or he didn't have the power to do it. And I think that's contributed to the crises we see today. They have long roots in the vulnerability of the real estate sector, which was allowed to, benefit from this kind of structure, take on massive debt, along with local governments who rely on land sales for revenue and also take on a lot of land-backed debt. So some of the policies that were articulated then could have addressed this. I think there are significant missed opportunities. And the property tax in particular, which she has put back on the agenda, was very unpopular, clearly with local officials, with urban households who hold their wealth in property often, and we didn't see it implemented. Xi Jinping has now amassed more power with a central committee aligned around his personnel. What is he going to do with that, right? Is that, those obstacles to the third party agenda from his first term now removed? Or are these constituencies still too powerful? Because I think structural reform to reset the basis for local government, to reset this important part of the economy, the real estate, which is 20 to 30% of GDP, are crucial to stable growth going forward. So having amassed more power, what is he going to do with it? And I have some speculation there. It's the government in some ways has created crises. So, for example, the policy in August of 2020 to limit the debt system, the 3 red lines on the debt of real estate developers, right, triggered a kind of the crisis, right, that's now reverberating, undermining revenues for local governments, hurting property developers, causing mortgage boycotts for homeowners and investors who think they'll never get their houses. So this is a government triggered crisis. Is that to reset and to return to this policy agenda, to shake those who were obstacles to implementing structural reform and things like the property tax? Or was it simply a unintended crisis, right? We can in some ways look at zero COVID in the same way, right? It's in some ways triggering crises with such extreme lockdowns. Is that intentional or unintentional? And what is he trying to signal with triggering crises? Does that create an opening for difficult structural reforms, or does it actually lead to the flip side, the state, on the real estate sector taking over private assets, bigger role for the state, intensifying the ability of the state to surveil people through the implementation of COVID programs? What's the purpose of these crises, right? Were they created intentionally? And are they going to lead to fundamental structural reforms, or are they really going to just intensify a kind of state presence in the economy and society? So those are really puzzling to me. But it led me to think in the first term, Xi wasn't nearly as powerful as people thought he was if he wanted to implement this agenda, because we haven't seen it implemented yet. So those are just some speculations.
It makes me want to ask you, but I won't ask you, but I'll say it anyways. If you could guess what the next crisis will be that will be triggered by government policy, but you don't have to answer that, but neither of you. Unless you want to.
My mind is turning. That's a great question. Maybe David wants to jump in.
Oh, thanks.
I mean, I would think about the state sector, right? So the resources of the economy have so much been focused on the state sector, right? In credit investment allocated to state-owned enterprises, they're not the most productive part of the economy. They're not the biggest employers, right? And the allocation of resources to the state sector has like starved the private sector to a certain extent. Private sector that's very present in services and that sort of thing, and smaller enterprises hurt by COVID lockdowns as a big source of employment. So I think just this orientation towards the state creates lots of risks in the economy.
David, do you want to?
Well, I think. Well, we saw the emergence of one this summer. If you remember the pictures of the Jialing River in Chongqing, where it basically dried up, and in a way that, at least to me, brought home the potential environmental crisis that China is going to face. And this is obviously one that wouldn't be manufactured by the CCP or by the machinations of the political elite. And so whether it's drought, whether it's flood, whether it's the exhaustion of the aquifers in the North China Plain that provide much of the water for something like 400 million people, that this is the looming crisis over China. There's been a tremendous amount of growth of knowledge and appreciation for environmental issues in China over the last 30 years. But it strikes me that China, like the U.S., has reached, whether the scientists are right or not, we've reached a threshold where these things are going to be accelerating. Their impact is going to be greater. Their disruptions are going to be greater. And how the Chinese political system, the Chinese people respond to these things will be a central challenge over the next, who knows, the remainder of this century, perhaps. But nonetheless, they're going to pose fundamental resource constraints and challenges to the viability and success of any regime.
Sorry, I didn't mean to turn it into a dark discussion, but I appreciate that. Yeah. I know we're at 5:47, so we wanted to set aside some time for audience Q&A. I'm looking in let's see, Mon and Noor, I don't see any questions right now, so we can keep going. But if anyone has any questions, they'd like to raise their hand, or if anyone has their hands up, or drop a question in the Q&A box, or sorry, the chat box, we can address those. No one yet, so I'll keep on asking. I have many more questions we can talk about. So I'm curious also, we've covered this. Let's see. How would you, give me one moment, I'm sorry. Actually, David, I have a question for you, and this wasn't one that we prepared, but you're a scholar of the Great Leap Forward, and you're a scholar of Maoist, of the Mao period. A lot of people have tried to draw comparisons between Xi and Mao, not because they're the same, obviously, but there are just some interesting distinctions or differences between the two. This is perhaps a big question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about, where do you see, what are your reflections on that comparison? What are your thoughts about the two? And how much, in terms of Xi's accumulation of power, how powerful is he really compared to Mao, and any other thoughts you have about that?
Well, certainly I would at the superficial level, say these are the two most powerful leaders in the history of the People's Republic of China. But as Susan rightly pointed out, if he's so powerful, why couldn't he push through the kinds of changes that he wanted? That when Mao wanted to change things, or at least launch campaigns and do other things, he was able to do it, even if it meant practically destroying the party in the process. And that speaks to a fundamental difference, that Mao imagined some ability to reach directly to the Chinese people, to mobilize them. And indeed, mobilization of the Chinese people was a fundamental aspect of his ideas about rulership. Xi Jinping is much more about control, about keeping things in order. Indeed, probably a reaction to his experience living through the Cultural Revolution, that keeping a lid on many of these problems rather than either encouraging people to speak out or to mobilize marks a fundamental difference. So he's very strong within the context of the existing system, which he's pushing in certain kinds of directions that he wants it to go. But Mao had much greater power to move in all sorts of directions that often led to disaster, but speak to a much greater degree of power than I associate with Xi Jinping.
Susan, do you want to weigh in on that, or any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about technology and the technologies that facilitate governance and the different environments in which Mao and Xi exist. And in some ways, they both could exercise censorship and information control in a kind of old technology environment for Mao and a new technology environment for Xi. But I was thinking about the legibility of society and surveillance and the information that the state has, and something that we've seen implemented to an unprecedented degree in the case of COVID controls. So Xi has at his disposal a much more powerful high-tech kind of surveillance apparatus, and I wonder, what does he do with that legibility of society? Yes, so that's in building on what David said, which I thought was very insightful. I was wondering about that kind of 21st century technological environment.
We have a question we have a couple questions popped in now. So let's start with Jacob Wood. So Jacob, you want to unmute yourself and then just introduce yourself briefly, and then love to hear your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, David and Susan. Yeah, my name is Jacob Wood, and I recently returned from China about a year ago, last year, but doing business consulting over there. My question really is, what would need to happen so for the U.S. and China relationship to find some sort of long-term thaw intentions? We saw the other day on Monday, Xi and Biden met, so there's a lot of headlines are optimistic all of a sudden again. Well, I agree with both of your assessments that there are a lot of headwinds on both sides. And it's really hard to see with things like Taiwan Policy Act coming up. You look at, we expect more export controls in the tech sector. And that's not to mention, China action on that side. So, there seems to be a lot of intractable issues that are difficult, unfortunately, see a path forward. But what would need to happen, or practically speaking, is there wiggle room here that you see in the next year or so that could come together that actually saw more of a sustainable path forward that doesn't have to be ratcheting up tensions all the time? Thanks.
Who would like to go first?
I think aside from specific issues, the biggest problem in U.S.-China relations is that, as the Chinese say, there's no two suns in the heavens, right? That both the United States and China want to be number one, think they should be number one. And it's very hard to share number one. It seems to me that both the United States has this national identity of the leading power, the most powerful country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And China says, we were that once and we will be that again. And that obviously means a change in the hierarchy of status and power in the international system. And that's, I think, driving the political elites in both societies in important ways. And how you convince them that that maybe there can be two number ones, or that that being number one isn't so great, or that, as you suggested both in your question to Ambassador Huntsman and here, that the costs of that are so great to both societies that we need to sort of step back and say, wait a second, that we have these shared problems. We're part of the same Earth, and that Earth is in crisis in important ways, in many ways, and we need to step back and sort of say, we'll both be better off if we put this to the side, or otherwise figure out how to build this cooperation. That said, I think that politics in each place makes that extremely difficult, that each side has fundamental concerns, whether it's about Taiwan or about military preponderance or losing military preponderance on one side or the other, that just plays into the hands of national security elites who further this kind of almost arms racing kind of logic here. And so it becomes extraordinarily difficult to think of ways that we can do this. Some pretty practical outgrowths of cooperation, whether on health, whether on the environment, whether on a number of other things, might begin slowly to temper down some of the competition, but the chances of producing enough positive effects to overcome the bias in the systems today, I think, is very difficult.
Yeah, and if I were just going to complement what David said, I would think about your question, Jacob, was what would need to happen for a long-term thaw in these tensions. And David was talking about the international relations aspect, and I would point to the domestic politics aspect. So I think a lot of that depends on the looking inside and what the leaders need to do to keep their own domestic political house in order, and what that domestic political scene empowers them to do or constrains them from doing. So we're awaiting the final results of the House, looking at divided government in the U.S. That might constrain Biden. Ostensibly, Xi Jinping will be less constrained, and except for the real crises in the domestic political economy that may constrain him in terms of resources and that sort of thing. So I think the domestic politics are also an important part of the answer to your very good question.
Looks like we have a Norm Page, and then we have questions in the chat box, as well, but we'll go to Norm first. Norm, do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes, Norm Page, and I know many of you on this on the call here, including David. And I wanted to ask, actually, the question that I was thinking was a follow-up really to both what David said and what Susan said. And I'm going to make the preposterously ambitious proposal to make a different analogy to address this can there be two tigers in the on the mountain? Can there be two suns in the sky? Because I completely agree that this is where we are. And I lived in China for 13 years and practiced law there and taught law there. And this is a metaphor that I tested with my students, and I got thumbs up. My students in China, I have gotten no good responses in the United States. So I'm hoping for a little bit of encouragement here. And that is, I picked up or repicked up, Tai Chi when I was over there, and especially Tuisho, push hands. And I said to my students, the relationship between the United States and China, I am going to pitch this metaphor of push hands. That is, this is not a walk in the park. This is a martial art. And yet, the better China gets, the better we get. The better we get, the better China gets. This is the nature of doing push hands. But the critical point is you are always in contact. The point at which you are not in contact in your push hands competition is the point of greatest danger. And that, to add in the global South piece of it, my vision here is, here you have the UN Human Rights Council, or whatever it is, the General Assembly, hopefully United Nations, and you've got the global South participating with or certainly watching with their own agendas, their own development agendas, and they are seeing this push hands competition. You can either say US and China or the West and China. Let's just keep it at US and China. And that it simply is not, nobody, the other 75% of the world out there, that is the global South, isn't interested in a who's number one as a existential requirement. They want to develop themselves, and the question is there a possibility for stability and also political acceptability that we can essentially this is going to be this endless competition, but it is always improving both sides. You can be friends or not friends. My push hands teacher said the number one thing is to feel your opponent's intention. And the way that you can feel your opponent's attention is to understand them very deeply. So is that going to, any chance for this metaphor to survive in the United States? Say yes, David.
All right, let me say yes. And one of the problems that Susan and I try to address in our own small ways is the cultural blinders that American students have about how China is run and how China works, and what conceptual lenses we take to look at China. So we see China as an authoritarian regime or autocratic regime is the words that we often use. We see the human rights abuses in Xinjiang and other parts. And these weigh heavily on the mindsets of many Americans. They certainly speak to special interests in the United States in ways that mobilize them and so on. And so ultimately, maybe maybe not push hands, but a more Taoist kind of going with the flow to accept that the Chinese political system, in ways that in some ways, realist scholars of international relations say, let's just concentrate on our national interest and forget about domestic arrangements. Let's forget about human rights and so on, and just think very narrowly about our national interests. And there, if we can get to understanding each other's national interests and being clear about them, we could probably arrange a modus vivendi, or a way to get along. It's very difficult for Americans to do that. On the Chinese side, again, not coming from an open democratic society like the United States, it's very difficult for them to understand how we work and what our concerns are. That I remember back when Xi Jinping, the vice president, came to the United States in 2012, just before he became general secretary. He gave a speech to the National Committee on U.S. China relations, and he said, China welcomes the United States to play a responsible role in the Asia Pacific, a reversal of the language the U.S. used to make all the time. And so at the same time, China has been, and Xi have complained about alliances, security relationships, and our relationship with Taiwan. And so for China, they're going to have to try to figure us out a bit better, but they're also going to have to learn to accept the alliance with Japan, the alliance with South Korea, the US security and value concerns with Taiwan are not going to go away. And so because of that, both sides have to recalibrate their views of the other. They have to figure out ways by which they can say that some of these changes are acceptable as the cost that goes along with learning to live with each other, avoiding nuclear war over Taiwan, or other kinds of issues. And I hope that the leaders and the political elites, the business elites, everyone in these two societies comes to that realization. The problem is, of course, there's always room, or there's always an incentive for someone to defect and try to gain instrumental advantage, either internally in each country or at the expense of the other country.
Susan, do you want to add to that, or do you have any additional comments?
I don't know if it's a very interesting analogy. I was thinking, and not a martial artist, but thinking about two-person work and how that's better when both parties are confident and strong. And we had a recent talk by UC Merced scholar Haifeng Huang, who was presenting research that suggested that our two populations in terms of attitudes are more critical in terms of popular perceptions of each other. And that Chinese citizens are not very aware of that because they live in a more closed media environment. The second piece of that I was thinking, but that's about attitudes, but also thinking about capabilities, and the importance of each partner getting their own house in order. And China faces some very, very deep challenges, and that could be addressed by structural economic reforms. Similarly, the U.S., we have this new kind of industrial policy. We haven't talked much about infrastructure, but to what extent is that the two partners interacting from positions of what kind of attitudes and what kind of strengths? So I would love to learn more about the pushing hands.
So we have I know we're at 6:07, but if everyone's okay with us going a little bit longer, we have a couple questions or a few questions in the chat. So the first one would be, if you guys are both willing to comment on, I referred before to the episode with Hu Jintao at the last day of the 20th Party Congress, where Hu Jintao was, for reasons we may never know or never understand, was escorted away from the main stage. So any speculations around what happened, working with obviously incomplete information, but any speculations about that, or any thoughts about what transpired?
I could say that I've read with interest commentaries and observed, and it was very painful to watch. Yeah, at first people thought this is about the name list of the 20th Central Committee, but that vote had already taken place, and then speculation moved on to what was before the people on the dais was the party charter, which we see has really positioned Xi Jinping in a way similar to Mao historically, and so that also eclipses Hu Jintao's kind of contributions, and so more kind of ideological and organizational than personnel, but certainly as symbolic, a political theater. It cemented the sidelining of balance among factions, certainly symbolized Xi Jinping's control, didn't accord with kind of norms of just like respect for the elders, and so in that sense conveyed just a kind of not very heartful form of immense power. So I think symbolically, that's what I observe.
It was quite the metaphor, whether it was intended to or not. So, David, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm almost in complete and fundamental agreement with Susan on that the other symbolism was the fact that no one in the front row of the dais looked at Xi Jinping, at Hu Jintao as he was escorted out, the sort of your history, and we don't want to deal with that history and things like that. But I agree that we'll never know what really went on there, and in some ways the symbolism of the passing of one era, and the willingness of what we assume to be, and maybe this isn't true for the party, of traditional Chinese norms of respect for your elders, of your predecessors, of in some important ways your ancestors, in that Hu was the party secretary. All of that seems to show the hardness of this regime, that it no nonsense, little human emotion, that we're just going to put this behind us and go forward.
Well, we're hitting now at 6:10, so I know we have more questions, but unfortunately we're going to have to put an end, come to an end. But I want to turn it back to Noor, but just want to, before we do so, just again really appreciate and thanks Susan and David for lending their insights and perspectives, and always welcome at the council, and really appreciate it. So Noor, do you have any final concluding comments before we wrap up?
My only concluding comments is that it was a fascinating discussion. I thank very much to Susan and to David and to you, Spencer, for leading the discussion. I also agreed with David. I thought John Huntsman was a little bit optimistic. I think David's brought us back down to earth pretty solidly. There are a lot of challenges in the U.S. China relationship going forward. After Bali, as we say, as David mentioned, we've got a floor. Let's hope that we go up and not down from that floor. So again, thanks Susan, thanks David, thanks Spencer. Really good discussion. Thank you all for your time and energy, and thanks to the audience for staying with us this long, and great participation. So I hope to see you all again on our next program, which, as I mentioned in the intro, is on December 6th. So good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.